Welcome to See You on the Weekend, an ongoing series of lectures featuring cutting edge, Thank you for joining today's See You on the Weekend webinar titled Pursuing Citizenship in an Era of Enforcement. We'll be starting the program in just a minute or two to get everyone a chance to get logged in. Thank you for your patience.
Hello, welcome to See You on the Weekend, an ongoing series of lectures featuring cutting-edge research and creative work of CU Boulder's world-class faculty. Excuse me. Today's webinar is titled Pursuing Citizenship in an Era of Enforcement. My name is David Means, and I'll be your moderator. I'm the director of the Office for Outreach and Engagement, which sponsors this series. We're so glad you could join us for today's program. Just a few logistics before we get started with the presentation. Attendees may submit questions by clicking on the question and answer or Q&A button located at the bottom of the Zoom window. These will be sent to the presenter and the moderators for their consideration and will not be visible to the other audience members. Due to the size of the audience, and we have more than 200 registrants today, the chat function has been disabled for this talk. We may not have time to get to your question, but we'll certainly do our best to address the themes and ideas that are most common. The webinar is being recorded, and by Monday, we will add a link to the recording on our website. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Ming-Soo Chen is an associate professor of law in our Wolf School of Law and faculty director of the Immigration and Citizenship Law program. Professor Chen received her PhD from the University of California at Berkeley, a law degree from New York University, and a BA from Harvard University. Her interdisciplinary scholarship focuses on the role of regulatory agencies in facilitating equity and inclusion for racial minorities and immigrants. She regularly teaches courses on immigration law, administrative law, and citizenship. Her book, published in 2020 by Stanford University Press, entitled Pursuing Citizenship in the Enforcement Era, presents the research that is at the core of her talk today. We are very lucky to have Professor Chen with us today, and I'm pleased to welcome her to See You on the Weekend.
Thank you so much, David and Sue and everybody with CU Outreach and Engagement who have set up this event. And of course, thanks to all of you who are sitting in the warmth of your home, joining us for this conversation. Today is definitely one of those days that I'm seeing the silver lining of doing everything on Zoom. I want to start today's presentation with a simple observation. And that is that in any given year, it's only about half of immigrants who are eligible that choose to pursue it. Now, that number is still a pretty large number. It was almost 1 million people in 2019. And yet, that number has changed over time. It's only about half, but it's actually gone up about 10%. And so a central question that I ask in this book, Pursuing Citizenship in the Enforcement Era, is why immigrants want to pursue citizenship and why in particular they're trying to pursue it now, contributing to that 10% increase. In today's presentation, I want to take you through a couple of the key findings in the book. And I'll roughly divide it into 3 sections. The first section of the book and the presentation will talk to you about how we got to this situation where only about half of our immigrants want to pursue citizenship, but again, that is changing. The middle section, which is the fun section, is that I'll share stories with you of some of the immigrants who I interviewed for this book. And then last, I'll close with some thoughts about how we can move forward from the situation that we're currently in to think about some new possibilities for incorporating immigrants into US society. So first, let me just start with a picture of how we got to the situation that we're in. And a lot of that begins with our own conceptions of how immigration and citizenship work. See, most people think about immigration as simply being a binary. You're either an insider or an outsider, you're a citizen or you're an immigrant. And usually, as this map shows, the US-Mexico border is considered the dividing line. Now, this image of what citizenship and immigration might look like is actually too simple. And so one thing that I talk with my immigration students about at CU Law School is that immigration is on a citizenship spectrum. So the reality is that immigrants are not in one of 2 statuses. Immigrants instead come to the United States in many different statuses. They might be green card holders, they might be on a temporary visa, such as an international student who's on an F visa, or maybe a high-skilled worker in Boulder. That would be very common to be on an H-1B visa. And of course, there are immigrants who live in the United States without documents. Those are undocumented immigrants. And so as we think about the legal dimension of citizenship, there are far more than the 2 categories we often think about. In addition to the legal statuses, there are also different types of belonging in the United States. And in my book, I call this substantive citizenship. And what I mean by that is that if we think about the daily experiences of immigrants, we can recognize that people feel differently about how well they belong in the United States, about how stable their job prospects are, whether they feel that they have a solid career. And they also feel very differently about whether their voices are heard in the United States, whether their voice matters. And so all of that combined, all of these different dimensions of substantive citizenship as well as legal status produce what I would consider full citizenship in the United States. Now, for the book, I conducted about 100 interviews with immigrants all over the state of Colorado, and in some cases in other parts of the country. I did this with the help of CU Law students who served as research assistants during over the course of 3 or 4 years, helping me to interview different groups of immigrants. And I'm not going to tell you 100 stories today. What I thought I would do is tell you about 4 stories that illustrate different types of experiences with citizenship. And don't be intimidated by this grid, it's pretty simple. What I want to start with are the stories of people who are high in formal citizenship, which is to say, these are mostly the green card holders who are not only here in the United States with a legal status, but that have the ability to go on to become US citizens if they would like to do that. So let me start with those who are high on legal status as well as high on substantive belonging. And what this first picture shows is a number of immigrants who have been serving in the US military. Now you remember that 50% figure I told you about in the beginning. Non-citizens who serve in the military tend to naturalize at much, much higher rates, about 7 times as high as the average US, the average naturalized citizen. And as an example of a citizen who had served in the military, I talk in the book about the reasons that people decide to join the military. And a lot of it is not because of this fast track to citizenship that service members get. The usual pathway takes about 5 years after a person has a green card. For someone who is serving in the military, it is very much condensed. It not only can happen in one phase where someone who has a temporary visa can get a green card and citizenship in one step, but it can also happen as quickly as 100 days after basic training. So everything about this experience gives a strong incentive to serve in the military in order to become a citizen. But the experience of most of the servicemen and the vets that I interviewed was that they joined the military because they wanted to give back to the country. Most of them felt that they were already American, even if they did not have formal legal status. So as one example, there was a gentleman I interviewed named Jose. He came to the United States at a young age. He talked about growing up and reading Captain America comic books and feeling that when he had the option to join the military, that it seemed like a very natural thing to do. And upon return from deployment, he felt very much that his time in the military served as a second passport. You see, he was eligible for US citizenship, and in this case, he had not actually naturalized yet. But he mostly didn't feel that he needed to, because with the service documents, he felt a strong sense of inclusion in America. And in fact, he said in some instances to his US citizen sister, "I am more American than you, having served in the military." So this would be an example of what it looks like to feel socially, substantively, and formally that you belong in the United States as a non-citizen. Now, next to these gentlemen, I have a picture of someone who is actually a CU professor, and his name is Bob Marshall. He is a Canadian immigrant to the United States. He originally came to Canada, came from Canada in college to be an international student. He ended up staying in the United States through graduate school. He married a US citizen, which is how he got his green card. And he continues to be on a green card today. And when I met Bob, he had said that for the 15, 20 years that he was eligible to naturalize, he had never felt the need to do so because as a white immigrant from Canada, for whom English was his native language, he felt that he was an invisible immigrant and that his green card was essentially as good as US citizenship. However, it was interesting to note that when I met Bob, he had, for the first time in that 15 to 20 years that he was eligible, decided to fill out the N-400 form that an immigrant fills out if they want to file to become a citizen. And he hadn't decided if he was going to fill it out, but he was thinking about it for the first time. And one of the reasons that he was thinking about it is because 2017 was the same year that President Trump enacted a policy that has come to be known as the Muslim travel ban. It's now been rescinded. But in 2017, it was something that was causing a lot of attention and a lot of worry among immigrant communities. Let me say more about that as we look at this next group of green card holders. Now, the group that is here on the left is a group of refugees. Now, like non-citizens who serve in the military, they have an unusual and expedited path to US citizenship. And to be clear, these are individuals who have received their refugee designation overseas and then are coming to the United States with that assurance, as opposed to asylum seekers who might be coming to the US-Mexico border without documents and then seeking to remain on the basis of asylum. So these refugees in the United States also, like non-citizens in the military, naturalize at a very, very high rate, far higher than the average green card holder. Somewhere upwards of 85–90% of refugees go on to naturalize and become US citizens. And so legally, this group is very secure in the United States. However, in talking with a lot of refugees, they express overwhelming gratitude for the chance to live in the United States. They, unlike other immigrants, have access to cash assistance, job training, English training, and as well, if they're lucky and they live in places like Colorado, which has some of the best refugee integration outcomes in the country, they end up feeling that they are welcomed into their communities. All of that notwithstanding, a number of the refugees I talked about said that they were grateful to America, and yet they would never feel American. They would always be a refugee and never be an American. And that was because they felt a sense of cultural distance. Their citizenship essentially was just the next step in a long list of requirements that began with their refugee resettlement before they came to the United States. And so it was, I don't want to say that it's hollow, but it was an example of an individual who might be legally very secure, high in formal citizenship, and yet somewhat low in substantive belonging. Now, this gentleman on the right, his name's Salvador. He lives in Colorado, in Aurora, and works at Mi Familia, which is a nonprofit organization that helps to empower Latino communities, in part by helping green card holders apply for citizenship, and then post-citizenship helping them to register to vote and to encourage them to participate in the political process. Now, Salvador himself is an immigrant, but he also works at a number of the citizenship workshops where my law students and I went to meet many of these immigrants in the course of assisting them with that N400 form I mentioned earlier. Now, Salvador told me that, like Bob Marshall, many of the workshop attendees had been eligible for citizenship for 10 or 15 years on the day that we were visiting. And yet most of them had not until 2017 felt the need to apply for citizenship. Although they were not invisible immigrants, they felt that their green card gave them a de facto level of protection. And what had changed for them, and the reason they were coming forward at that particular moment in time, is that they felt they needed to have the protection of citizenship as an insurance policy against the next harsh immigration policy or discrimination that they might feel in their own countries. One example would be a woman that I met at this workshop named Luz, and she said, "I've heard of the Muslim travel ban. I'm not Muslim, but you never know who is next. They might change the countries that are in the travel ban. It could be that Latin American countries are joined. I feel very much that I need to come forward for citizenship to make sure that my family is safe." So let's just pause for a moment. I've shown you 4 experiences of immigrants in the United States, all green card holders in various ways who can become citizens. And yet each of them in their own way has become a little bit nervous in the current climate that we're living in, even though none of them are at risk of deportation since they all have legal status. Only the refugees included immigrants who are from Muslim countries, but those particular refugees were already inside the United States and on their path to citizenship. And yet for all of them, the Muslim travel ban felt like a wake-up call. And again, this was true even for the Canadian non-citizen who was in my sample. So I thought this was an interesting puzzle about how the experience of non-immigrants seeking a citizenship was playing out. Now, I want to tell you also about the other side of the coin. In the interview sample, about half of those we interviewed were individuals who don't have a path to citizenship. And these are the immigrants on this side of the grid. They consisted of a mix of different statuses. First, it consisted of dreamers or undocumented immigrants who came to the United States at a very young age and have lived their whole life in the United States. It also included temporary workers. Again, because I was interviewing Boulder, that was significantly H-1B high-skilled workers. That can include engineers who are working at Google. That includes a number of the professors who are on the CU campus. And the third category is also a temporary visa, that's the F visa, that a number of our international students hold. And collectively, the three of these served as examples of individuals who have lesser legal status than the individuals we were talking about before. So in all three of these cases, there is some sort of protection. An international student on an F visa, for example, is here in the United States on a lawful status, but that status is limited to the time that they are here for their study. So if they came for college, they would be authorized to stay in the United States for roughly 4 years. An H-1B worker, similarly, is here in the United States for a specific job and for a specific period of time. And a dreamer who over the last 10 years, since 2012, might have something called daca status, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And what that allows is a reprieve from the risk of deportation for 2 years at a time. But very importantly, none of these visas have a path to US citizenship. And they have various types of work restrictions that accompany them. And so that's what I'm talking about when I say that they have lower formal status than the immigrants, the green card holders we talked about before. And as you'll see from the stories, in addition to their different legal statuses, they also have varying experiences in their daily life as immigrants. So let me just tell you a little bit about the international students and the high-skilled workers first. This is a group I think that doesn't get nearly as much attention as the dreamers, and is actually one of the groups that I most enjoyed learning about in the process of researching this book. So this is not an actual picture of the individual I interviewed, but I think someone who typified the immigrants that I interviewed in this category was this gentleman, daca. He's an immigrant from China who came to the United States to take a job in the sciences. He talked about the time he had been in the United States, which at that point was pretty long. He had renewed his H-1B several times. He had children with him in the United States. He was married. He had a pretty stable life in the United States. And yet when I asked him, if you were given the opportunity to adjust your status from H-1B to a green card, would you do so? And would you want to have US citizenship after that? And daca said that he was actually at the point where he was becoming eligible for those steps. And he was having a very hard time deciding whether he wanted to do so. He felt really ambivalent about it. He said a green card might be nice because that would provide some economic stability. It would make it a little bit easier to travel between the US and China, where his parents still lived. But ultimately, he felt that he really wasn't sure. He felt that it essentially was like a transaction. If the cost of gaining US citizenship would outweigh what he had to give up, which in this case would be his Chinese citizenship, then he wouldn't do it. But if he felt that the benefits were higher, then he would. And so this to me was an example of a relatively limited sense of social belonging in terms of affiliation with the United States in the midst of having this limited legal status. Now, as compared to high-skilled workers, international students have additional limitations. So I've called this like blocked paths to citizenship. It might be more true to say burdened or broken paths, but in the case of F1 international students, the F1 visa does not lead to a path to citizenship. And in fact, coming to the United States, presuming that one would go on and become a citizen, could be considered immigration fraud. In order to get that temporary visa, one has to say that they are here for the specific purpose of that visa, which is to pursue their course of study, and that they don't have an intention to abandon their foreign residence. Now, many of the international students I spoke with were not unhappy at CU or in the United States, and yet their experiences belonging in the community was that of feeling that they were guests. So I talked with one individual, a gentleman named Walid, who's from Saudi Arabia, and he was an undergraduate who said that he was enjoying his time here. He wanted to soak up the experience as best he could because his understanding was that he was just here for now. He would take his education and any experiences that he had and any friendships that he made, he would take those home with him, and felt that the purpose of his degree here was to make investments in his country at home. There were other individuals I spoke to who felt similarly, that they were guests passing through the United States, but they might not have felt quite as positively as Walid did. For example, there was a gentleman named Abhishek who was here from India, and he talked about his worries hearing about this Muslim ban again. He said, why would I want to stay in the United States when my degree is very valuable in my home country? And yet inside the United States, I'd be viewed with mistrust. Now with this,
So it seems we're having some technical difficulties. Bear with us for a moment while we figure out what's going on. So it looks like Professor Chen has lost internet connectivity. This could have to do with the storm that we're experiencing. Oh, great.
I'm back.
You're back.
Excellent.
Wonderful.
I'm so sorry about that. We knew this might happen, and I had felt lucky until we joined.
Yep. Thanks so much for bearing with us, everyone. And we'll hope that we are able to maintain connectivity. I'll also mention for those who joined late, feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function throughout the remainder of Professor Chen's talk, and we'll get to those in a little bit. Thank you.
Right. Thanks so much for letting me come back. I hope you were able to get a drink of water or something in the unplanned intermission. But just to pick up where I left off, I was in the middle of telling you some of the stories from the interviews that my students and I conducted here in Colorado. And this is actually the last set of interviews I wanted to tell you about. These are interviews with dreamers. And some of these might be stories that you're familiar with. These are young people who came to the United States who were formally undocumented until they received this 2-year protection beginning with the Obama administration. And the classic story that I heard is really summed up in this Time magazine cover of individuals who are all undocumented coming from many different countries who say, "We are Americans, asterisk, just not legally." And that was very similar to the experience I heard as I interviewed other dreamers who were on the CU Boulder campus. They talked about how they felt that they were in every sense American. They spoke English, they listened to American musical artists, they had always gone to American schools, and yet legally, they knew that they did not fully belong and that they would not be able to go on to become full citizens, even the ones that I interviewed who had that coveted DACA status that already set them apart from many of their families and community members who didn't have that protection. So as one example, a woman that I interviewed named Gabrielle said that, I originally thought that I could be a DACA forever, but during the last couple of years, she realized that she felt that nobody could actually be secure. Now, mind you, this was before the DACA protection was rescinded in 2017. It was before the lawsuit went all the way to the Supreme Court. And it was, of course, before President Biden restored the DACA program on January 20th of this year. But just the fact that there had been so many changes in the availability of DACA, that there had been so many failed attempts to enact a pathway to citizenship, the dreamers that I met were feeling that sense of insecurity, despite a lifetime of feeling that they belonged in the United States, at least socially. So where does this take us?
I'm sorry, Ming, to interrupt. Do you want to be sharing your screen again? I think we lost that after the...
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. Okay, are you seeing a slide that says citizenship and security?
Yes, we've got it.
Great. Thanks for your patience, everybody. Okay, so the collective experiences of these immigrants that I met was one of citizenship insecurity. All of the immigrants had different levels of legal statuses, and they also had different experiences of full belonging. What I found in general was that whatever level of belonging they felt over the longer term, it was starting to feel more restricted. They were starting to feel more shaky about their place in the United States during a time of intensifying immigration enforcement. And so that was a shared experience among immigrants, even though I was interviewing immigrants in so many different legal statuses. And I want to take just a few minutes to talk about the effect of COVID-19, which happened after the completion of this book, but certainly has been very much on the minds of non-citizens, just as it has been for all of us. Now, when COVID-19 started, or at least when the US realized that COVID-19 was an issue in our nation, they very quickly shut down the borders, initially to China, where COVID-19 started, and then to the rest of the world. Over time, the number of restrictions against non-citizens as a result of COVID has ranged from 40 to 60 policies just in the course of 1 year. And the story that has been told is that COVID-19 is a condition that comes with foreigners to the United States, and that if we shut out the immigrants, we can shut out the disease. And I think the effects of COVID-19 have been to even further amplify that sense of citizenship insecurity that I was telling you about. And indeed, many of the immigrants that I talk to on a daily basis outside of the formal interviews for the book do talk about a sense of worry And some of that extends even beyond the immigrant experience to those who have already naturalized to become US citizens, and even those like me who were born in the United States, but by virtue of being a racial minority, perhaps especially being Asian American, have felt that they are treated like foreigners and therefore viewed with intense mistrust during this period of time. And so wrapping up, when I think about the message of this book, I think it is one that has become only more true during the time since it was completed. That is to say that the sense of citizenship and security that is felt among non-citizens has been enhanced, that the problems have not gone away with the simple initiation of a new presidential administration. In fact, Joe Biden famously issued 8 executive orders on immigration in his first day, and has proposed some of the most ambitious legislation that we've seen that would, among other things, include a pathway to legal citizenship. And yet, perhaps not gaining quite as much news coverage, in the first few weeks of Biden's administration, he also enacted and extended several of the travel bans with the discovery of more contagious variants of COVID-19 in Africa, in the UK, and other places. So you see this immigration enforcement continuing and continuing to fuel the sense of not belonging that I imagine a lot of non-citizens would be feeling. So in terms of how we can change course, I think in a nutshell, what I would talk about is this North Star of integration. So much of what we talk about when we think about that US-Mexico border and when we think about immigration policy is about the exclusion of immigrants. And what I would like to see and what I propose in the book is that we instead reorient immigration policy to include the possibility that immigrants can become citizens someday. This means, in a formal sense, broadening their pathways to citizenship, not only for undocumented immigrants, which is what it would be the centerpiece of the legislation that is proposed in Congress right now, but also finding ways to smooth the pathways for other categories of immigrants. So for example, the green card holders that I mentioned, many of them through the last few years have struggled that even though they are eligible for citizenship, the increase in fees, which at some point was proposed to be nearly double, increasing the citizenship application form from costing about $600 to costing over $1,000. There have also been citizenship backlogs that have held people who are otherwise eligible in the queue for more than 18 months, in some cases 2 and 3 years before they're able to get US citizenship. And so these would be examples of other ways we need to smooth that path for immigrants. And then, of course, outside of the formal experience, so much of what I've told you, ironically, because I am a law professor, is about the limits of the law in achieving full citizenship. And so some of the other suggestions that are in the book are about enhancing immigrants' experience of substantive belonging in the United States, thinking about ways that they can gain economic footing. For example, perhaps revisiting the public charge rule that has been actively under review just this very week, but would essentially make it more difficult for somebody to pursue a green card if they didn't have a certain level of wealth that would ensure that they wouldn't ever need to draw on food stamps or welfare or other kinds of social support. So combined, I think those would begin to point us in a new direction and to reorient the experience of pursuing citizenship in the United States. And again, I'm sorry for all of the interruptions to the performance, to the presentation. Hopefully through questions, we can fill in any gaps in your understanding. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Professor Chen. We've got a number of really great questions that have come in. But to begin, perhaps you could tell us something about what inspired you to focus on the concept of citizenship in your work and in your writing.
Sure. I mentioned briefly in passing that I myself am born in the United States. I'm the child of two naturalized immigrants. Both of my parents migrated from China to Taiwan and then to the United States when they were starting graduate education at Montana State in Bozeman, Montana. And so I think learning their experience initially of coming to the United States as international students, frankly, feeling some of the same ambivalence that I saw in meeting international students through the research for this book. And yet over time, deciding to make their life here in the United States, getting green cards, getting married, having children, buying a house, becoming US citizens. I think a lot of that had encouraged me to focus on an experience of immigration that was personally meaningful and that professionally felt was not being talked about a lot in the coverage of immigration, as instead being about people who are not like me, people who are perhaps not like you, not members of our community.
So a couple of questions related to the research that is presented in the book. You mentioned that students were involved in the research. Could you say more about that? What did the students do? How were they selected? How do you think this impacted their educational experience?
Yeah, this was one of the real joys of working on the book, is that I had a number of law students who were really interested in spending time outside the building, actually meeting immigrants as part of their education and what it could mean to become an immigration lawyer. And so many of these students initially served as volunteers with me for things like the citizenship workshop I mentioned, where we met many green card holders who were already eligible for citizenship. And because the lines were becoming so long, we often found that those immigrants were sitting around. And so while they were sitting around, we started asking them questions and started to interview them. What I wanted to point out, one of the things that was so helpful about working with CU law students is that our students come from so many places themselves and offered so many different cultural experiences and language skills and relationships that I wouldn't have had on my own. So for example, CU Law has a number of students who serve in the military. And that's a group that I would not have had a lot of knowledge about, nor a lot of access to. But a couple of my research assistants were able to help draw on their own networks to reach out to non-citizens who were serving in the military to talk to them about their experiences. In some cases, even vets who had been deported. And so long before the rest of us were using Zoom, they were using Skype to conduct interviews with individuals in Mexico and other parts of the world. I also, for the DACA interview, it felt very important to go beyond the Front Range. And so one summer I had a student who was doing work with legal aid on the Western Slope, and she is a fluent Spanish speaker. And so she was able to help me reach out to DACA recipients and dreamers in the Western Slope who were far more comfortable speaking their native language. And I do have another language, it's Chinese. I'm unfortunately not fluent in Spanish, but that would be another example of the good work that the students did that was able to improve the book and expand the reach of the interviews.
So how did you decide which immigrants to focus on? And in particular, do you think that the focus on the Colorado context shaped this research in any important ways?
As I mentioned in the presentation, I set out on purpose to interview many different kinds of immigrants. If you were keeping track, there were 6 different legal statuses of immigrants that I interviewed. And so, in the terms of social science, we call that seeking variation in the interviews. But what I thought was really interesting in looking for that variation was that in addition to legal status, we set out to and also found immigrants from many different races, from many different national origins. And what we really wanted to focus on was their everyday experiences. In some ways, it's actually much easier to interview people who are activists, who are the heads of organizations. But what we really wanted to know is what it was like to pursue citizenship if standing in the shoes of the non-citizen. And so it was with these interviews with everyday people that we really enjoyed doing that. In terms of Colorado, I do think some of the experience reaching out to non-citizens in the military that I was just talking about were particularly pronounced in Colorado. As you probably know, Colorado Springs has the Air Force Base. There are many different components of the military that are represented here. And I think that we had greater access to some of those populations in Colorado than we might have elsewhere. And I think as well, the experience of talking with refugees in Colorado was also a really illuminating one. I don't know if people always think about the diversity that we have in Colorado, but as I mentioned, the refugee resettlement agencies in Colorado are some of the best in the country. And so I think that also gave us a good point of access and being here in Colorado that we might not have had in other places.
Great. So were there any expectations that you went into this research with that ended up not being borne out by the evidence? Were there any surprises that you found particularly noteworthy?
Well, I think I went into this book having a little bit of a naive view that everybody who was here in America would want to become American if they could. And I thought what I would find is maybe a story of some disappointment or struggles. But what I expected to find is that everybody shared that same American dream. And so I was actually quite surprised to hear from refugees that they hadn't chosen America. They had chosen to leave their home countries, but in some cases they had asked for Australia, and it just happened that they got the United States instead. It was really eye-opening for me to talk to international students and H-1B high-skilled workers about whether they intended to apply for a green card and US citizenship if and when they could, and to have them say that they really weren't sure that they wanted to. And that continues to be borne out since the completion of the interviews. The number of international students has declined over the last 2 years for the first time in a very long time. And I think that was very humbling to discover that the sense of challenge that immigrants were facing was starting to show in their experiences. It wasn't just that the United States government was not being welcoming enough to immigrants. Immigrants were getting that message, and it was changing how they were feeling about America.
So we've received some questions that are, I think could be characterized as general factual questions about citizenship and the process related to that. I'll read this question, which was posed: is citizenship still proportional to the population of an immigrant's country of origin? For example, if Russia had the greatest population, the proportion of citizens accepted would be the greatest, as a hypothetical.
Sure. So if you look at the process of from entering the country to eventually becoming a US citizen, there are a couple steps along the way. And so what this person might be asking about in terms of proportionality is that for legal migration, there are certain numbers of visas that are available according to the country out there. And so in that sense, if Russia had the greatest number of people who are interested in coming to the United States, they would actually end up having the longest wait because there is a cap on the number of immigrants who can come through those channels that is set by Congress every year. Once a person is inside the United States, there isn't a rationing of green cards or US citizenship according to their national origin. It's really just at that initial stage of admission to the United States where you see that allocation among different countries in the world.
So someone is wondering if it's always a requirement to give up your current citizenship to become a US citizen, or does that depend upon your country of origin as well?
That very much depends on your country of origin. And that was something that I would like to follow up on more in future work. I think it can't be a coincidence that a lot of the international students and high-skilled workers I talked with who were very hesitant about eventually becoming citizens were individuals from Asian countries, almost all of which would require you to give up your initial citizenship in order to become US citizens. On the other hand, many Latin American countries have moved to where dual citizenship is possible. So at least in a couple of the snippets, the interviews with immigrants who are green card holders at these workshops, most of those were Latino immigrants who were seeking citizenship, knowing that they wouldn't have to give up their original citizenship. That said, though, I did think it was really interesting to see some of the non-intuitive examples, the counterfactuals, if you will. And so, for example, Bob Marshall from Canada, Canada does allow for dual citizenship. And so for all of his hesitation about whether he wanted to become a US citizen, in some sense, he had nothing to lose. He could continue to be a Canadian citizen and also be a US citizen. And yet, as I mentioned, he had a lot of hesitations, some based on just what that would mean for his identity, to layer on an American identity while also retaining his Canadian citizenship.
So you spoke to, amongst your interviewees, motivation for actually taking the step of pursuing citizenship. There's a set of questions we've received about whether voting rights or political participation are a significant motivator for folks who do end up pursuing citizenship.
It's a good question. And actually, this could have been one of the surprises I mentioned when you asked earlier about if I had any expectations that were upended. I find that political scientists and other academics who study citizenship assume that the right to vote would be at the top of the list of motivations. And while I did find some people who felt that that was an important right, most of the immigrants I interviewed did not put that at the very top. Most of the people I interviewed who talked about wanting to become citizens or not spoke first about a sense of identity and belonging. And then after that, in terms of instrumental rights or benefits, many of them talked about the ability to travel freely, and in some cases talked about the ability to sponsor family members. And all of those are impacted by becoming a citizen or remaining a green card holder. And so voting was up there, but it wasn't at the top. And that was another example of kind of being humbled as an academic to hear from others that what you thought was the most important didn't end up being bearing out in the interviews. But of course, that's why we do interviews.
Yes, so that sort of is a nice segue to a whole set of questions we've received about the politics of this. And in particular, there's some questions folks are wondering about the rationales, the concerns, the arguments against immigration and for reduced or more stringent control of citizenship. One person has raised the question of whether resources such as water, concerns about limited resources, are a significant factor, do you think, in arguments to restrict immigration? Could you speak just, that question in particular, or generally, what you see and what you've seen in your research as the rationale for a more restricted access to citizenship?
I think what I see presently is similar to what has been true historically, which is that in the United States, there have been waves of sentiment, sometimes anti-immigrant sentiment toward immigrants and other periods of welcome. And in the periods where the borders are more restricted, it's often because Americans are feeling threatened in some way. I think probably one of the most cited examples would be those who are concerned about economic threat and the worry that if American workers are struggling, that we wouldn't want to welcome immigrant workers to take those jobs or potentially to lower those wages. So I do think that is one of the concerns that has been true in different periods of time. I think you're seeing a resurgence of that during COVID-19. In fact, one of the 40 or so immigration actions I mentioned that has come out just in the last year was an attempt to restrict legal immigrant workers because of the economic recession in the United States. That most of that policy has actually been overturned in courts right now because it was said that particular rationale relied on a provision of the immigration statute that was about protecting the national security of the United States in the sense of the territorial boundaries of the United States in an instance of war. And so extending that to public health and then additionally to the economy, according to this federal court decision, was not appropriate. But nonetheless, I think the impetus, that sense of economic worry, I think is certainly behind some of the desire for more restriction. Another one that I'll mention that I think is important to consider is a sense of cultural threat. And I was actually just reading something this morning in the Washington Post about the sense of cultural threat that has shaped people's views even of child separation, family separation, and unaccompanied children arriving at the US-Mexico border. And that those who have been, I won't say comfortable, but more willing to allow those policies to continue, have also shown that they feel a great worry about immigrants settling in the United States and not choosing to speak English and otherwise bringing morals that might not be consistent with the United States and essentially challenging the culture of the United States. So I think that sense of economic threat and cultural threat are there. There have been studies done to show whether or not those end up being true. Some of that evidence is mixed, but at least economically, it tends not to be true that immigrant workers would end up taking American jobs, especially at the higher end of the skilled spectrum. And during COVID-19, that was true as well. With the immigrant worker bans, there is scarcity for some jobs, but not the ones that were actually being banned from the United States. To this question about resources, this is an interesting one. It is one that I've started to hear. I'm not necessarily saying this about the individual who's asking it, but I've actually heard it from some of the most right-wing conservative think tanks in the United States. There is a strand of anti-immigrant sentiment that talks about the need for population control and worry about the environmental impacts of immigrants in the United States as a reason to keep immigrants out of the United States. And again, I'm not attributing it to the individual who asked this question, but some of those groups that have taken those positions have historically also had a lineage in the theories of eugenics. And so that is concerning to me because, of course, environmental impacts are real. But I think sometimes the putting together of these concerns can end up letting immigrants bear kind of an undue weight for policies that really are the responsibilities of the entire world. I mean, of course, the US in many cases would have more rigorous environmental protection standards than many of the countries that people are coming from. So it's really not clear that the environmental impacts on the United States would be worse simply from having immigrants come into the country.
So one of our participants, I'll read this question. Some would assert that neither major political party wants immigration reform because both parties want this as a wedge issue. Your thoughts, please, Professor Chen.
That's really interesting. I mean, it's certainly true that immigration has been a wedge issue for many years. The last significant bipartisan legislative reform we have, I would say, was probably in 1986 with the Immigration Reform and Control Act. Immediately after 9/11, there was some pretty significant legislation that included reforms to immigration. But even at that, at this point, that's been 20 years. So, if you just look at the facts, it seems like Congress hasn't been particularly committed to being able to pass immigration reform. That said, I'm not sure if it's the case that the parties are not interested in immigration reform. I think there are pieces of immigration reform that have been interesting at different times. And what I try to focus on the book, in many cases, is actually the least controversial of the immigrant groups. Groups like DACA, for example, the Dreamers have had bipartisan support. They've just never had it all at the same time. There have been times that the DREAM Act or some version of it have passed the House, and other times when it's passed the Senate, and you've had presidents who've been willing to sign it, but you've never had all of those ingredients where you have the bicameralism and the presentment producing an actual law. And so, I think that is actually one that a lot of legislators would like to see. And I think President Trump, although he is the one who rescinded the DACA program, he had even expressed a lot of ambivalence about the Dreamers because he sort of saw how sympathetic that group was. So I think there are segments of immigration that parties would like to see. And that they haven't been able to get past, in part because it has become a wedge issue. I think not just because of the politicians, but also the way we talk about immigrants in the media, the way people think about immigrants. And again, that was one of the reasons I wanted to focus on these groups of immigrants who are everyday immigrants who live in our community and really could be future Americans, as opposed to talking about immigration in these more polarized terms that I find to be not as productive.
So there are a number of questions that are related to, I think, could be put in the bucket of sort of cultural issues as opposed to the political. But before we go into those, which I imagine might involve, some substantial responding, given the complexity there are some pretty straightforward questions related to the complexities of policies and how this stuff actually works. So maybe we can take care of a couple of those relatively quickly before we go to the cultural issues. One of those questions is, will you please speak about the process for a person in a relationship with an American citizen becoming a citizen upon marriage?
Sure. So I'm assuming in this question, we're talking about someone who might be getting married when they're already inside the United States, as compared to someone who is presently abroad and would be coming to the United States in order to marry. In that case, an individual who's marrying a green card holder or a US citizen has a 3-year path to US citizenship, unlike the usual path that would take 5 years. But when they first become eligible for citizenship, they have something that's called conditional LPR status. That is to say, instead of becoming a legal permanent resident right off the bat, which is the other name for a green card, they became a conditional legal permanent resident. And the way that the law looks and hopes to protect the institution of marriage and to make sure that marriage is being entered into for legitimate reasons and not only for the procurement of an immigration benefit, is if that marriage ends within 2 years, that condition is not lifted unless certain presumptions can be overcome in an interview with an immigration officer. There are exceptions to that in issues of domestic violence and with battered spouses, recognizing that there is a pretty significant power differential between the US citizen spouse and the immigrant spouse. But generally speaking, what we're looking at is essentially a waiting period where an individual will only be a conditional green card holder for 2 years, and then would take 3 years instead of the 5 to become a US citizen if they choose to file that N-400 form.
Great. So some moments ago, you were speaking about DACA. Somebody has asked the question, what do DACA recipients need to do to gain citizenship?
So this is an important question. DACA recipients cannot gain US citizenship. So I guess what DACA recipients need to do is hope that American citizens will encourage their legislators to pass the DREAM Act. And then at that point, a process might be laid out for DACA recipients who, as I said, short of that, limited 2 years of protection at a time, would otherwise not have a path to citizenship. Most of the proposals that I've seen for a DREAM Act, including the Citizenship Act of 2021, the one that is currently being considered in Congress, would require some measure of getting right with the law, as President Obama used to say. Usually that would be to pay fines and penalties. In most cases, immigrants are already paying taxes, even if they lack a social security number. There's a thing called an ITIN, an individual taxpayer identification number, that allows them to pay taxes and be in compliance, even though they don't have the social security number and for that matter won't draw benefits later on. So they need to make sure that they're up to date on taxes, that they've paid any fines and penalties for any unlawful status that they've had in the United States. And then there are additionally requirements, usually, that look into one's level of education. If someone has a criminal history, there's always a requirement that the individual have entered the United States at some earlier point in time. And the reason there is that cutoff is because the legislators don't want to create a new incentive for individuals to rush the border. So the idea would be that if the bill passes, you had to already have been in the United States in order to qualify for citizenship. And then there usually is still a waiting period. So in the Citizenship Act of 2021, what's being proposed is essentially an 8-year waiting period where a daca recipient who becomes eligible for citizenship through the DREAM Act portion of the bill would be able to get a green card initially, and then would have to wait something more like 8 years instead of 5 to go on and become a US citizen. But it all depends on the bill that would be written because we don't actually have a law that will allow it right now.
Someone has requested that you say something more about the Public Charge Act, what that is, and how it's been changed.
So it's really complicated. I have to say, I just taught my immigration students about this last week, and it took me about an hour to get up to date on the litigation. But at a more basic level, the fundamentals are that in the immigration statute, there are a series of reasons that an immigrant may be considered inadmissible or not eligible to enter the United States. And among those is the possibility that an immigrant would become dependent on the state for welfare. And that requirement has actually been in the statute for a long, long time. So that isn't the new part. The new part is that during the Trump administration, there was a regulation enacted within the agency that handles the issuance of visas. And in the redefinition of that term, the standard was made much more stringent. And so individuals who had received Medicaid, other benefits that they were legally entitled to, food stamps, SNAP, certain forms of insurance for children, different kinds of social supports, again, ones that they were legally entitled to, had a greater chance of not being able to get a green card later on because it was seen to be a predictor of their future need to rely on the United States. And what was happening actually before the regulation went into effect is that you found immigrants in many instances not collecting those benefits, again, ones that they were legally entitled to. And I think where this was particularly disturbing is in a number of mixed status families where you have a parent who's an immigrant and a child who's a US citizen, and the parent might be afraid to collect food stamps that benefit the entire family because of their worry that by doing so, they would not later be able to get a green card and then naturalize and become US citizens. So this was very worrisome. There was essentially this chilling effect before the law even took effect. And then the regulation did take effect, despite the fact that I believe there were about 200,000 public comments filed to the agency in opposition to this rule. But the regulation did go into effect. There were immediately 17 different lawsuits that have been working their way through the federal courts. And I believe as of last week, the litigation that has kept the public charge rule from going fully into effect, it did officially go into effect in February, but it was stopped again. And that litigation, it seems at this point, will not be further pursued because the Biden administration has changed course. And so the US government is no longer seeking to defend the new definition of public charge. So as of today, I believe, new cases of immigrants coming to the United States would not need to worry about being labeled a public charge for collecting benefits that they are, again, legally entitled to.
So one last question for now that is kind of a straightforward question about terms and policy. This person submitted a question on the US passport application and renewal. It states that US passports are only issued to US citizens or non-citizen US nationals. Can you please explain what is the difference? Thank you.
So it's a technical difference that applies to a relatively small number of people. So US nationals who are not US citizens, it's often referring to territories like Puerto Rico. I think America Samoa has a particular relationship with the United States that allows them the diplomatic protections that an American would have if needed, but doesn't grant them all of the other rights and for that matter, obligations of being a US citizen. And so, one of the more familiar examples would be the right to vote. There's been ongoing discussion about whether Puerto Ricans should be able to vote in the United States. Interestingly, for America Samoa, there's actually been a movement to oppose the elevation of the national status to US citizenship. Because American Samoans are afraid that they would lose their own sovereignty and a sense of cultural identity. So I don't think the lines split up evenly, but just as a matter of understanding the difference, the much smaller category of those who are US nationals, but not US citizens, I was referring to those groups.
So I'd like to read this question in full. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I'm a graduate student here at CU, and I'm wondering how can I, as a community member and student, help international community members feel more welcome and accepted in my community? How can I help increase their substantial citizenship?
I like this question a lot. I'm glad to know that there are people who want to help. I think on the CU campus, I do think that overcoming a sense of social isolation is something that I heard again and again from international students that has been challenging to them. And Diana Salazar, who is the director of our International Student and Scholar Services, is really excellent. She and her staff offer a lot of programming to try to encourage international students to learn about American culture, but also to have opportunities to mix with CU students who are US citizens and live here domestically. A lot of those programs don't get very well attended. So I think one way to be supportive is simply to show up. A lot of times I find international students, I actually have a niece who is an undergraduate at CU and is an international student. And I know that she really appreciates opportunities to just have lunch with someone who's a Native American English speaker, so that she can practice her English, both to feel more a part of American culture, but also to feel more comfortable in her classes. She's very bright. In this case, she's a niece through my husband's family. And she had most recently lived in Japan before she came to the United States. And her exposure to advanced levels of math and science and engineering, it far outpaced what I learned in high school anyway. And yet she was really terrified every time there was group work because she wasn't sure if she would seem like a burden to the rest of the group because English was not her native language. And I distinctly remember her apologizing because English was her third best language after Japanese, Chinese, and Taiwanese, so I guess actually her fourth best language. So I think a lot of those everyday experiences are ones where people really can help. And then other than international students, in the broader community, there are a number of events, at least pre-COVID, there were a lot of events to help refugees feel more welcome. And so one big event that has happened most years in Colorado is a Thanksgiving dinner to welcome refugees into American families so that they can understand what that holiday looks like and learn about food and traditions. Boulder Public Library has like English language tables to help immigrants become more familiar with English language. Intercambio is a nonprofit based here in Boulder that has a similar purpose. And all of those organizations also offer citizenship classes that can help immigrants prepare for the civics and history portion of the citizenship test. So those are just some ideas that are very local to our campus and our community.
So we have some questions that have to do with this relationship of the law to how people are feeling about belonging. And so I'll read one instance of that. How do, or even how can, policies and laws influence how people feel and how they believe that they fit into a country?
So I think, to me, this was an interesting thing in the research. On the one hand, there's a pretty easy to understand mapping of an exclusionary policy, that is to say an immigration policy. I talked a lot about the travel ban during my presentation. A policy like the travel ban ended up instilling a sense of not being welcome, not only for those who were coming from Muslim countries, or in some cases, those who were already in the United States, but who had family members who might want to come to the United States, but would have been blocked by that policy. So perhaps not surprisingly, a lot of those immigrants started to feel less welcome because the policy was more exclusionary. But what I thought was interesting is if you'll remember, I opened with that 10% rise in the number of applications for citizenship. And so that to me it's something in the book I talk about as being defensive citizenship. And that was an interesting phenomenon to think about, that for some people, feeling that a law is unwelcoming will actually prompt them to become an American citizen. And I think, I think other scholars have mixed feelings about that. On the one hand, I do think making citizenship available as a formal matter is important. You don't force people to become citizens, but giving them the option, I think, is very important. But on the other hand, maybe it's just a romantic myth, but it would be nice for individuals to become Americans because they want to, and not because they feel like they have to, or are afraid that they can't live a good and full life if they don't have that protection or that insurance policy, as some of the interviewers spoke of.
Someone has asked what you feel about our immigration laws as you think about 10 years, 20 years, 50 years down the road. Do you believe we will still be struggling with the challenges of immigration and immigrants in the future?
That's an interesting question. I feel like we're still catching up. So much of immigration policy for the last several years has been about like drinking from a fire hose. So, when I talk about that North Star, that already is trying to reorient to a longer term perspective, by which I mean, looking beyond the lawsuit that might need to be filed next week. But 10, 20, 50 years. I think what I hope we'll see is an immigration system that is more rational. I think right now there are many problems with the way that the immigration system works before we even get to rewriting of the immigration laws themselves. And I think people all over the political spectrum would agree with that. In immigration court, for example, the wait to have to see an immigration judge, which could be in order to hear your asylum petition, or it could be to find out after a criminal conviction whether one needs to be removed from the country, and any range of number of experiences. That wait can be upwards of 2-3 years just to have an initial appearance before an immigration judge. And if there's a piece of paper missing, it might be another 2 years before the next appearance. So that would be an example of a way that the immigration system is broken that I think people on both sides of the political spectrum would feel is certainly not ideal. So hopefully some of those improvements will be in place. At the same time, I do think immigration is a perennial issue in the United States. Some of these struggles that we learn about. I wrote my PhD dissertation about language rights, for example. A lot of the earlier examples of policies trying to declare English as the only language, went back to the time of Benjamin Franklin, when they were worried about immigrants who were only speaking German and seemed like they would never assimilate to the United States. There were certainly echoes of that and what we hear now about Spanish, or since 9/11 that we hear about individuals from Muslim countries. And so I think there is a dimension of this insider-outsider dynamic that is part of human nature and goes along with living in a very multicultural society. But again, I do hope that there will be more rational and more humane ways of responding to the diversity and all the challenges that come with it.
So someone has offered a comment in response to the question I read previously from our international student. As a retired international student advisor and also connected with the refugee community, I found that having at least one good, trusted US friend is the most welcoming experience that can happen. The hard part was getting the US student neighbor to become that friend. I don't know if you have any response.
I agree. I mean, I think that I think that's right. I mean, for some of the reasons that have been hinted at in these other questions, immigration can seem like a very intimidating problem. And even among law students, immigration law is notoriously one of the most complicated technical areas of law. Like people say that immigration law is, it rivals tax law for its complexity. And yet at the same time, for some of the things that we're talking about, that sense of low substantive or social belonging, sometimes those interventions are actually not very complicated at all. It really is at the level that this individual, this international student advisor is suggesting.
So you mentioned, the so-called Muslim ban and that the rules around that have changed or are in reconsideration. Someone's wondering, are there any countries that the US absolutely prohibits a person from immigrating from?
On a country basis? I don't think so. And the reason that I don't think so is that one of the more significant immigration reforms was in 1965, was the Hart-Celler Act. And that was a law that eliminated national origin distinctions. There are still kind of a rationing of the numbers of immigrants who come from each country in a year. But in terms of a flat exclusion, I can't think of one that's on the books right now. That's not to say that we've never had them. Some of the most foundational Supreme Court cases in immigration came out of the late 1800s in the era known as the Chinese exclusion era. And so that was a federal law that prevented individuals coming from China, and in some cases of Asiatic descent was the language used in the laws of that time, that it prevented those individuals from coming to the country. There were similar laws that said that if an individual was allowed to come into the United States, usually for purposes of performing a certain kind of work, like building the railroads or working on mines, that those individuals would not be able to ever naturalize and become US citizens. So certainly there have been laws like that at different periods of time. But as far as I'm aware, since 1965, in terms of a discriminatory law drawn on the basis of a country, I don't believe that's the case. However, that's not to say that there aren't other factors that can screen people out that may correspond to factors that also exist more in some countries than in others. And so, the Muslim ban might be one example. The other thing is that within the United States, citizenship and national origin is very unusual. If you're looking at other civil rights laws, citizenship discrimination is actually legal. So for example, if an employer wants to say that no foreign workers are welcome, that is entirely permissible under US law. And so unlike race and gender and other groups, citizenship discrimination is actually legal in the United States. But again, that fine and difficult to untangle line, at the same time that citizenship discrimination is permitted, national origin discrimination for laws inside the United States, things like employment and education, it is not permitted. Religious discrimination in many cases is not permitted. So when you have something like the travel ban, it's quite complicated because a lot of it depends on whether you believe the restriction is happening because of citizenship, because the person is coming from a Muslim majority country, if you believe it is because they are of the Muslim faith, or if it is because you believe that they are associated with groups where there is a particularly high national security risk. And again, parsing those is not always easy, but to the question, just on the basis of country, not as far as I know.
So is there research into how Native Americans view immigration today? This is an interesting question given you're positioned in a law school that has a real strength in terms of Native American issues and tribal sovereignty, things like that. Do you have any awareness or knowledge about Native American views?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I've actually wanted to work on something, like to collaborate on a project with one of my many American Indian law colleagues at the law school for some time. What we've talked about mostly is, so in terms of how Native Americans feel about immigrants coming to the United States, I don't have any systematic polling data or anything like that. I do sometimes hear as a refrain, sort of a challenge or maybe more of a reminder, probably more to Americans than to immigrants, who have called America a nation of immigrants, or who say things, often in a well-intended way to say that, we're all immigrants, or someone in our family was an immigrant. And I think a lot of times Native Americans will point out, well, that's not necessarily true, but I don't know that that's so much a rejection of immigrants. I think I take and understand that to be more wanting to command a certain amount of respect and acknowledgement of the longstanding and original roots of Native Americans in the United States. What I did want to say though is that in terms of citizenship, this is the one that I thought would be really interesting to work on with some of my colleagues, because this notion of citizenship has played so differently for groups who have tribal sovereignty. And so, this might have some similarities to Puerto Rico, or, this was also the case with Hawaii before it became one of the 50 United States. But I think the view of citizenship and the ability to become a US citizen takes on a different kind of meaning when the minority group that we're talking about is actually a tribe that is sovereign, right? And wants to be able to hold a political identity outside of the United States. Which is quite different, I think, than an immigrant or a racial minority in the United States who wants to be able to take on the rights and obligations of being a US citizen as a matter of political identity.
So we are coming to the end of our time here. For folks who want to pursue this subject further, are there resources that you would recommend or ways they can plug in? I believe, Emily, if you want to do a screen share, we have a slide that might speak to this.
Sure, I can speak to this. This was not planned in this way on purpose, but it's really well timed. The law school is going to be hosting a full day conference on Friday, April 9th. It is online and it is free as long as you register ahead of time. And you can see from this wonderful sea of faces, we have some of the preeminent immigration and citizenship scholars, practitioners, and in some cases, just immigrants who are going to be speaking over the course of that day. And the theme Pursuing Citizenship is inspired by the book that I've been talking about today. What I want to highlight is over on the right side of this, Thursday night, the night before this conference, we've collaborated with the Conference on World Affairs to offer a performance from Modus Theaters of docu-monologues. And they've performed on campus before. If you haven't seen them, I really recommend it, even if you don't want to hear all our academics speak on Friday. I would at least tune in on Thursday. When we'll have undocumented immigrants who have shaped their stories into dramatic readings that they will share in that performance. And Mimi Tankoff is an immigration judge who was for a long time in Denver. She's more recently been reappointed in New York, but she's going to be reading one of the immigrant narratives as part of that performance. So I think that between the very moving experience of the performance on Thursday night, the more academic conversations on Friday, I think that would be a really great opportunity to learn more. And I will mention at the very end, you'll see this if you register for the conference, at the end of the day, there will be a breakout session. So in addition to this kind of question and answer that we're doing, the idea is to promote dialogue among the different attendees. So that might be something that this group enjoys very much as well.
Well, a few remarks to close our program today. First, and most importantly, thank you so much, Professor Chen, for sharing your research with us this afternoon. We're so grateful for your time and very impressive expertise and the fantastic scholarly work that you do and that your students do. Thanks to all who joined us today for your time and attention, your participation through your many excellent questions. I would also like to appreciate Emily Musumechi and Sue Postmashirs, members of the Office for Outreach and Engagement staff who have been providing technical support behind the scenes today. You will receive an email with a link to a short Google survey tomorrow, everyone who's participated in the program. We very much appreciate your feedback. A recording of the lecture will be linked to online by the end of the day on Monday. So you can share this with folks who maybe weren't able to make it, or if you want to review this again at a future date. You can find this on the See You on the Weekend webpage, which is where you registered for today's lecture. Note that the recording will be closed captioned. This has been the second installment of our Spring 2021 See You on the Weekend virtual lecture series. Our last lecture of our spring series is on April 24th and is titled Face to Face with the Radical Right. Once again, advanced registration will be required. So thanks again to everyone for attending, and thank you, Professor Chen, so much for being here with us. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing all of you on the weekend again in the future.